Welcome to Brown Bag History for October 27th, 2021. It's nice to see an audience back in the building and my Zoom audience as well. As we start, we acknowledge the land, traditions, and culture of four nations, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So today we're talking about the high school boys outdoor club. And probably the most interesting thing about the club is their cabin that they built on the Jordan River. So we'll be spending a lot of time in the talk talking specifically about the cabin. But the club was started in 1929 by Mel Abbott. And Melvin Wesley Abbott began teaching at Revelstoke High School in 1924. And before long, he became the principal and continued as the principal of the high school until 1965 when he retired. This is his picture in the 1965 high school annual. He said that the boys outdoor club was his particular pet, and he called it rather a unique club and thought that it had more influence on the life of the school than any of the other clubs. We have, as well as the high school annuals with a lot of information, we also have an interview that was done with Mel Abbott in the 1970s, and we have 4 scrapbooks from the club. This was one of their scrapbooks with somebody had done a lot of work doing this lovely cover of for the wooden cover for the scrapbook. So the club was organized in 1929. Mel Abbott said that he called a meeting and the boys were quite enthusiastic. So they held their first meeting on October 25th, 1929 in the high school. Bert Woodland, who's shown in the photograph here on the right, was the first president, and Jim Armstrong was the secretary. The record book originally was kept by Arnold Simpson. They did a sort of commemoration about the high school boys club in the 1948 high school annual, and they had letters from some of the people who'd been involved in the original club in 1929. And they had a letter from Bert Woodland, who was the first president of the club in 1929. And in his letter in 1948, he said, "The club was intended to provide healthful and educational relaxation from the more prosaic duties of the student. And to this end, a headquarters adjacent to the trails and streams over which we were to hike and fish was deemed necessary." Mel Abbott said, "We decided we'd go out on the following Saturday, right after they started the club, and look for a site for the cabin." He said, "We went up to the Columbia, to the mouth of the Jordan, and up the Jordan River, about 3/4 of a mile, till we came to a lovely little island in the Jordan River. The river split there right around both sides of the tract of land that had beautiful tall timber on it, very little underbrush. And we decided that was an ideal spot. So they got permission to cut timber and to use Dominion property. Went to the Dominion land office and got the approvals. They arranged for the school board to lease the island for a 99-year lease at $1 a year for education purposes. And they were allowed to cut enough timber to build the cabin." So the first Saturday of November 1929, they began work on the cabin. They got the walls and rafters in place before the snow fell. Abbott said it was hard work because not having a horse or anything of that kind to pull out the logs or any tractor or machinery, this all had to be done by hand. When we got a crew of 25 or 30 boys, some of the logs we could pick up and carry by placing sticks through underneath them and one getting on each end of the stick. But very often when the smaller crews turned up, we had to use the block and tackle and just skid them out of the bush or float them down the river. It was heavy work, but the boys seemed to get a lot of fun out of it. And they turned out at 6 o'clock Saturday mornings, year after year, while we were in the process of building. time. My slides don't want to advance. There we go. Charles H. Davenport, who was an uncle of Helen Hammond, who a lot of people knew as a local school teacher. Well, Charles Davenport was a charter member of the club, and he also sent a letter to the 1948 high school annual. And he said, "How well do I recall the felling of timbers for the site and for the cabin walls, cutting the cedar bolts and floating them down the Jordan for subsequent splitting into shakes, packing the bricks and lumber over the Jordan Trail, and the steaming coffee and beans on the smoky fire." Abbott said it took us from 1929 to 1933 to get it completed with all the trimmings, to put lockers in it and cupboards, and even one time put curtains on, which the pack rats decided to chew. We finally gave way to the pack rats in that respect. We have quite a few photographs that came from a collection of the man on the left, Jack Dixon, and he was a member of the club, and there's several pictures of him and his classmates going up to the cabin. This is one of those pictures. The cabin had a big stone fireplace, sliding windows, and shutters on the windows. They had a phonograph, benches and tables which were attached to the wall by hinges and could be let down if they were having a party and wanted space to dance. The cabin measured 30 by 24 feet, so it had a massive stone fireplace, an excellent roof, good floor, and well lighted. It had tables, benches, a cupboard, and a Victrola. Prior to 1930, the spring of 1930, they'd just been using a log bridge, and then they replaced the bridge in 1930. In 1933, they started the first wing dam, which is one of many that they constructed to try to prevent erosion on the bank. In 1936, on the Easter weekend, the cabin burned down. They never did determine the cause of the fire or even exactly when it had started, because it wasn't until they actually went out there that they discovered that it had gone, and that nothing was left except for the fireplace. In the Revelstoke Review of April 24th, 1936, talked about the fire and said, "For those who have visited it merely for pleasure bent, the cabin will always be associated with part singing in the glow of a log fire, moonlight over the pine trees, minuets in hobnailed boots, purple evenings and opal dawns, and a blessed sense of detachment from the wearisome worries of the workaday world." It wasn't until 2 years later that the club decided to build another cabin. And so Mill Abbott said, in 1938, on the same site, using the same cement block for the corners and the same fireplace, we started a new building. There was information on the Boys Outdoor Club and their work on the new cabin in the high school annual of 1938, 1939. And it also mentioned that a girls outdoor club had been established in September of 1938. The first president was Marion English, Ken's aunt. They learned knot tying, sign reading, campfire making, Morse code, and first aid. They went for several hikes in the area and skied on Mount Revelstoke and did toboggan runs throughout the area. And they also had a skating party at Williamson's Lake. They said in the annual, the purpose of our club was not only to have hikes, but also to learn more about the great outdoors and how to conduct ourselves there. So they began their new cabin, but it said that there was bad weather and a late spring hampered their work. The logs and rafters had been felled and trimmed and peeled, ready for use. They received a $50 grant from the school board, bringing their club assets up to $90, and the tools were loaned to them by the forestry branch. It was completed by 1941, A lot of these photographs came from the 1948 high school annual, and that's why they're a little bit grainy, because they were from their newsprint photos. But Mel Abbott said the build was more difficult this time. The logs had to be brought from a further distance. Some of the shingle cedar bolts were cut 3 or 4 miles from the cabin and had to be floated down the river. Many of them were lost. I can still remember standing in the ice cold water up to my waist, well, until my legs were numb, pulling out shingle bolts. And that one particular Saturday that we ran them down the river, I felled a tree just back of the cabin to catch the boat so that they wouldn't go by. The water was very high at the time, but it swept in against the bank next to the cabin at that point. And I thought that it was still being hung up on the stump, but the pressure of the current was so great that there was quite a bend in the tree. And the way it was shaking, I was afraid it was going to pull it loose from the stump. So I worked my way on the tree with the axe with the idea of cutting the end off the tree to relieve the pressure of the current. I took one crack at the tree with the axe. There was a loud snap. The end of the tree was swept away, but the part I was standing on was snapped from under my feet. And I found myself in the water with the axe in my hand. He said, I didn't have the axe very long, but I did manage to get to shore without too much difficulty. And we recovered the axe about a year later when the water got low. He said the cabin played a very important part in the life of the school, that there were staff parties there, even on occasionally a staff meeting. He said often after school, the teachers would go up there in a group and just have coffee. So there was luckily a series of several photographs in the annual, and they're not the best quality, but here's one from 1941 showing them laying the sills for the floor, and you can see the fireplace behind them. And the new bridge that they built in 1942 in summer and winter. And then taking up the phonograph, because that was an important part of the cabin, because if they wanted to have parties in there, they needed their phonograph. And putting finishing touches. He said the club members got the most out of it. Each spring we had a big party, a huge feed, and we had competitions, chopping competitions, rifle competitions, walking a long narrow log over a pool of water. And he said after a number of boys had fallen in, they insisted that I try, and I joined them in the water before we were through. They also had competitions following a blazed trail. Mr. Abbott gave prizes such as hunting knives or axes for the winners. He said another thing that we did for years, I would take the boys out to Sicamous, rent a boat with a little motor on it and a number of rowboats. Usually they were 15 or 20 in the party. On a Friday night, we'd head up the lake on a fishing trip. We'd camp out on the shore that night, and in the morning, I'd get a long pole, tie it across the front of the powerboat, and attach the rowboats to the end of the pole, so that when we came down the lake, nobody had to row, and we had lines out from all the boats. We used to get some great catches. In fact, when we were building the first cabin, we used to come in on occasion with several hundred pounds of fish, which we sold to raise money to buy lumber for the floor of the cabin. There's one of the fishing trips in May of 1946. The only person we have identified in the photograph is Paul Salva, who's third from the left. So if anybody can identify anybody else in there, we'd love to know their names. That in later years, the river was rising and threatened to sweep the cabin away. In 1948, there was a flood throughout the Northwest. There was Chilliwack, the Fraser Valley was badly affected. The Columbia River, both in the United States and Canada, was badly affected. So they were preparing for the flood that year. They already had a wing dam built when their first cabin was in place. So they were filling the wing dam with rocks. And the boys here are R. Burton, D. Bevan, and Paul Salva. And it's hard to see in this pictures, but you can see that this picture was showing sort of the water starting to rise up around the cabin in May of 1948, and it was in June that the full flood took effect. He says, Mel Abbott said that they did have to deal with a lot of vandalism. He said, we had a lot of trouble with people breaking into the cabin between the weekly trips of the outdoor club and doing a lot of damage. While we were using the cabin, we found it necessary to build 2 bridges and 2 wing dams to turn the current. And he said that the boys learned a lot in the process. Even in laying out the cabin, they could use the theorem of Pythagoras to square the building, and they could use a little trigonometry to get the angle on the rafters and that sort of thing. So I really felt that of all the clubs, there was none that the students got more out of it than they did the work of the outdoor club. Of course, Mel Abbott was a math teacher, so that was right up his alley. He said, even today, I've run across people who were members of the club perhaps 40 or 50 years ago. I'm not in their company very long before the subject of the outdoor club comes up, and they start recalling trips they had and the work that they used to do up the Jordan River. This is a scenic photo from the 1948 lookout. It says, where the Jordan meets the Columbia. There's Mel Abbott with an axe in his hand. And in the annual, it said that this is when they were working on the, trying to stop the flood from coming into the cabin. So they were doing some extra work, trying to shore things up. There's Mr. Cox, Mr. Grauer, Peter Grauer, and Mel Abbott at the cabin around 1948. Mr. Grauer was history and teacher, social studies teacher at the high school. Not sure who Mr. Cox was. Anybody here remember that name? Well, this is 1948, so it was a little earlier. This is a group of teachers at the cabin in 1948. There's Mel Abbott, Mr. Hernick, Keith McCoy, L.S. Smith, Dorothea Lundell, Mrs. Pike, and Peter Grauer, and a couple of people we don't have identified in there. But he was talking about how they would have, even staff meetings up at the cabin sometimes. And there's the newly completed cabin in 1949. So a lot of the big jobs that they were doing in 1949 was after the 1948 flood. They realized that they had to do a lot of work to try to keep things, keep the water from flooding. So they were putting in a lot of work on the wing dam in that next year or so. There's go back through a couple of the notes here. The high school annual in 1942 talked about how they were continuing the work on the cabin. It said that they had shaked the roof. Heater was installed for the winter, and they built a 50-foot bridge to the island. Said the construction of this bridge with such limited equipment, we of the outdoor club chose to consider an engineering work of considerable merit. When the lockers and cupboards now under consideration are completed, the cabin will require only a phonograph and a lighting system to make it really comfortable. And then in 1943, it says, we were proud of our phonograph, not merely because it was dragged up the river on a toboggan against a biting wind, but with the mercury at 16 below, but it actually plays and has a very nice tone. We would like to express our thanks here to all the persons who kindly donated records to our amazing collection. And they even hosted a visit by the visiting Kamloops basketball teams at the cabin. In one of the record books from September 25th, 1943, says, we left for the cabin at 8:45 with the party mostly comprised of freshmen Crick, Bob Davis, Rusty Soanes, and George Spencer, under the leadership of Mr. Abbott. A bag of cement was carried up in 4 sections. Having arrived at the cabin, we commenced to carry clay for the chinking. Ramsden, McKinnon, and Donaldson arrived in time to aid with the chinking. Crick went for a swim with a sack of clay for company. At this point, the lunch gong sounded, so lunch was had by all. After this, the chinking was completed, and the gathering arrived home at about 6:15. First mission accomplished. So that's the kind of material that's available in the scrapbooks and their minute books. And another one, October 2nd. In the afternoon, Crick arrived and the mob began to play around. Pinhead Donaldson fell in the creek. And it said when they weren't going out to the cabin, some of the members were making furnitures in the manual training building, which was, if you might remember with the old high school, there was the pink building next to the high school. That was the manual training building. So they had a workshop in there. And so there's lots of other notes that we have available in the books. One from 1944 said April 15th, 1944, the second Revelstoke Cub Pack came and stayed overnight. These potential members gave a helping hand in clearing a pitch for the horseshoe game. Malcolm beat Mr. Abbott. Aim of 3 years accomplished, said Malcolm. And then they talk a lot of little notes about that, about the fun that they're having up there. In October 29th, 1950, there was mention of some of the vandalism. There's a whole series of photographs, I'll show these first, of the boys working on the wing dam and some of the other work that they were doing to try to divert the river from encroaching on the cabin. There's a boy there with the dark and white cap. That's Bud Stovall. He shows up in quite a few of these photographs. So a lot of work they put in, carrying rocks and cutting trees. That's digging a trench. So most of these pictures are from 1949. So as I said, that would have been the year after the big flood. So that was a big consideration for them, was to try to protect the cabin. Their wing dam in 1949. As I say, we've got lots of pictures of that. The boy in kind of a precarious position up there. Cutting down the spruce tree. It looks like it was an axe, but it's like there's a cross-cut saw there in the front too. And we've got names of some of the boys. There's Gordon Bell and his brother in that picture. And then there's several photographs just of the river itself. In October 29th, 1950, there was a note in one of their journals about vandalism. It said the state of chaos within the cabin was shocking. That the windows had been shot with a .22 rifle. Some cups and saucers had been broken all over the floor. That the members would have to raise money to fix the windows. They proposed a fate worse than death for unwelcome visitors if they'd ever been caught. But on September 21st, 1952, it said a troop of Girl Guides arrived at the cabin and bolstered the morale to such an extent that we were able to cut, split, and pile 2 cords of pine and cedar. And we've got several photographs of parties that they had in the cabin as well. There was a note in 1950 that the bridge had collapsed in the spring of 1949, so they built a new bridge. In 1955, they mentioned that they did some mattress work. They split cedar with rock ballast to prevent the water from undermining the cabin. It said early in the fall, the channel opening above the cabin was widened extensively by the use of dynamite on the southeast corner. Logs were also cut away from the channel in May. These had blocked the progress of the water down the new course. Another group of kids at the cabin. So this is a nice shot of the front of the cabin and the little sign that they had in the front, 1949. Still quite a bit of snow around it though. And this is some of the musicians and for a party at the cabin. And Christina Fiocco, who became a Catholic nun, is playing the accordion at the right. I don't know the other two people. If anybody knows their names, I'd love to know that.
High school and should have a picture of the Japanese film.
Yeah, we could probably figure it out from the high school annuals. Another couple of girls at the cabin. So every annual there was a little bit of a report about what the group was doing. So I just put in one of those. This was from 1958, and they were still using the cabin at that time. In 1956, it was noted that the club membership averaged about 35. That as usual, the cabin was found to be in a mess due to the carelessness and the deliberate vandalism of those who have used it. Furniture was broken, most of the windows had been shot out, and our cups and cooking utensils had disappeared. They also said that most of the previous year's cribbing had been washed away. That unless this can be replaced before high water or the river diverted into the new channel, the club will probably be without a cabin next year. But as far as we can tell, the cabin was still in use in 1960. There was mention that they were still going to the cabin in 1960. It's still mentioned in the high school annual that year. Said, but on Thanksgiving weekend of 1959, a washout had occurred halfway up to the cabin, bringing down dozens of trees and carrying away the trail completely. During the winter, the club members had been busy making fishing tackle in the shop. Mr. Abbott continued as sponsor of the Boys Outdoor Club until his retirement at the end of 1965, total of 36 years. And in 1965 and 1966, Paul Salva and Bud Stovall were sponsors of the Boys Outdoor Club. They were still going on winter hikes, but they pretty much gave up on trips up to the cabin, although they did go up to shovel the roof in heavy snow. And we don't have the record of the year that the cabin was either torn down or burned down. I've been trying to find that, and I haven't been able to find out that date. But we know it was there at least until about the mid-60s, and then we don't really know what happened to it after that. Just wanted to point out this painting that we have in our collection. We have a few paintings done by Mel Abbott. You can kind of tell that he was a math teacher, you know, in the precision of his painting, but really lovely work. So we were happy to have this one that he did of the high school cabin. And now all that remains is the fireplace. And a lot of people have, this has actually become one of my most asked questions in the last couple of years is, what's that fireplace out in the middle of nowhere in the Jordan? This photograph was taken just this week by Pam and Gerard Doyle. But I know a lot of people have sent me photographs and wondering what the heck that was. So that's all that remains. And it's funny that that was the original fireplace from the 1930s cabin. And that was the only thing that remained after the first fire. And it's still there after whatever happened to the second cabin. So if does anybody else have any information or stories they'd like to add? Well,
the only thing is that so the river changed its course. So the river that surrounded the island changed over to where it is today, and it used to flow just a completely different direction. So you can see when you're at the cabin that you're kind of on an old island.
Mhm.
and then the river ended up going towards a more southern direction to where it now meets the Columbia.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, just for the our Zoom audience, we had somebody explaining how the river had changed course over the years, and so it sort of really changed where the original site of the cabin. So thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with Brown Bag History in 2 weeks, when we'll be talking about the boy at the driving of the last spike, Edward Mallandane. Thanks for coming.